So hello everyone. Today I will be going over real-time pragmatic inference across cultures, evidence from a non-industrialized society by Riskin, Salinas, Piantadosi, and Gibson. So to start with, we'll just go over some background information on the subject. Studies have shown that speakers make inferences about knowledge state and listeners infer about communicative intentions during conversation. So this is just a fancy way of saying pragmatic inference exists. So speakers will infer what the listener knows, and listeners will infer what the speaker is trying to communicate during conversation. The issue is most linguistic studies investigate weird people, which is to say residents of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. So we don't actually know if this is a universal. We also don't know if specific types of adjectives, such as color, are less descriptive than others, such as size, because size is more relative and color is more universal. We don't know if this is something that can be replicated in countries outside of weird countries because we haven't studied them. So then the purpose of this paper is researchers from MIT performed fieldwork on Tsimane, which is an indigenous Bolivian language, and it's spoken in a non-industrial area in the Amazon, and they have very little formal education, meaning that these effects can be compared to the results found in weird languages or weird people. And so specifically Tsimane, as found by Gibson previously, was shown to make fewer distinctions based on color for natural objects. So objects such as peppers tended to be distinguished less by like red pepper or green pepper than in English. And also low entropy colors tended to be used a lot more than high entropy colors. So colors such as black and red tended to be used a lot more than colors such as blue and yellow. And the investigation. So the paper investigates Tsimane's pragmatics to understand how weird and non-weird languages might potentially differ. So again, it's just to map if pragmatic inferencing exists in Tsimane, and if it does exist, if it's the same as in English, or if there are some different aspects of it due to the different aspects around things such as color in Tsimane. So it does so with two tasks, an eye tracking test and a referential communication task. So the eye tracking test tracks processing, and the referential communication task tracks production. No previous work has been done on pragmatic languaging processing in Tsimane, so there was a secondary goal of investigating the viability of eye tracking tests in the field, as it requires a certain amount of equipment, and they wanted to see if the results were usable and how they would come out. Because Gibson had already mapped language production or aspects of it, this was not a worry for that aspect of the experiment. So then firstly, there was a referential communication task. So as we can see from the image, participants were shown a laptop with 4 images on it, with potentially 2 types of contrast, and then occurring in 3 different states. So 1 contrast, 2 contrasts, or no contrast, and the contrast being based on size or color. So then the participants were asked to describe the object in the green square based on these contrasts, and their production was mapped. So then the results. So firstly, we have this graph. Every red X is a individual mean for a Tsimane speaker for color. Every blue X is one for size for an individual Tsimane speaker. And then the bars represent the means of all the speakers when aggregated. So we can see through this that participants produced more color adjectives than size adjectives in every condition. So it was more common to produce a color adjective no matter what, even in areas with a size contrast. Also, the presence of one contrast increased the likelihood of producing the other and vice versa. So as previously mentioned, color contrasts were obviously more common in size contrast, but also it increased the likelihood of producing a size contrast in an area with a color contrast. So both of these are effects that are recorded in English as well. So then secondarily, to investigate the referent type, artificial or natural, and the entropy level, so the color adjective type, there was a second aspect of the color distinction. And so the researchers found that participants were more likely to produce low entropy colors, as Gibson had previously posited, as black and red were produced more than colors such as blue and yellow. So then contrast also upped the likelihood of producing a color adjective for all referent and color adjective types. So a contrast for color or size increased the likelihood of producing that adjective regardless of what type of color it was. And the discussion. So despite the documented lower use of color words in labeling tasks, color adjectives are used more than size adjectives cross-linguistically. So in both English and Tsimane, color adjectives were used a lot. So both adjectives were more likely when disambiguating reference in a pair. So color adjectives were more common as produced when they were disambiguating a potential color contrast, and the same for size. So then contrastive inferences were stronger for size than color cross-linguistically. So again, this goes in line with the previous weird studies that showed that color is less contrastive. It's used just more generally than a size contrast, where a size adjective will be used very frequently for solely a size contrast. So then the second experiment was an eye tracking test, and it had a very similar setup to the previous one. Participants were played an audio recording from a Tsimane translator asking them to point at a specific object. There were 3 types of states, so 1 contrast, 2 contrasts, and no contrasts, and the contrast could either be based on color or size. And then their eye movement was tracked as they pointed at the target. So then the results of this experiment. So here we have the lines of fixation based on target and competitor in English and Tsimane, and whether or not the fixation was altered by size or color. Each hash represents the confidence interval as the data was bootstrapped because the sample size was so small. So participants were more likely to make anticipatory looks to target if it was contrasted. So in a contrastive environment, anticipatory looks were more common as the adjective onset occurred. So there was a larger effect in both language concerning fixation for size adjectives as compared to colors. So this just means that size is more contrastive than colors cross-linguistically. So then, as in the previous experiment, color entropy and referent type, so natural and unnatural, was investigated. So here we have a graph showing English and Tsimane, the fixation lines based on low entropy and high entropy color, and artificial and natural objects. And the findings of this were that there was no real qualitative difference in the data between Tsimane and English. So then, both English and Tsimane participants were more likely to make anticipatory looks to the target when it was contrasted than when it was not. So this just means that if there was a contrast, the pragmatic inference portion made it more likely that participants would focus. So then in both languages, the anticipation effect on fixation was more noticeable among size adjectives than color adjectives. So this just means that cross-linguistically, size was more contrastive than color. Finally, pragmatic inference took place in real time in both languages and drove predictive eye movement rapidly. So the onset of an adjective in a contrastive environment immediately started off fixation on potential targets or competitors. And contrast effect did not differ significantly by referent or color type in either language, despite the previously investigated difference in usage in Tsimane as opposed to English. So color focus or fixation did not change by color entropy level or by whether or not the referent was natural or artificial. So this is in line with the findings in English. So in the conclusions, English and Tsimane are strikingly similar when comparing results from both tests. So concerning both production and fixation, similar effects were recorded cross-linguistically. Size is more contrastive than color, and either type of adjective is more likely to be produced in a contrastive environment. Grisaille maxims, and therefore pragmatic inference, are likely cross-cultural and not restricted to weird languages. So even though this test isn't an end-all be-all conclusion on that matter, it's shown that pragmatic inference and Grisaille maxims operate in similar manners in human communication, regardless of if a language is industrialized or has a formal education structure. Obviously, more research is required to be more definitive in this statement because this is only one non-weird language and non-weird languages are not homogeneous. However, it adds confidence to the idea that this is cross-cultural. Finally, size was more contrastive than color in both languages, suggesting something was intrinsically less contrastive about color. So even though size was used in different manners in the previous Gibson test, or color was used less frequently, it was an effect that was recorded cross-linguistically, meaning it was not some quirk of Tsimane or English or weird languages that size was more contrastive. And yeah, thank you very much for listening.